Royal Guard had marched into the Forbidden Wing many times in stories, but never like this. Tonight, as thunder cracked over the palace, they pushed open the sealed gate and froze, because deep inside the dust-covered chamber, something was glowing, a crown, the Queen's long, lost coronation crown, untouched for decades, sat pulsing with light, as if it had just been placed there moments ago, and the guards suddenly realized. They were not alone in the Forbidden Wing. The courtyard was silent now, but the echo of the alarm still lingered, vibrating faintly against the stone walls. Midnight had a way of amplifying small sounds, the distant drip of water, the rustle of a flag in the chill wind. But tonight nothing felt ordinary. The Royal Guard had trained for breaches, for whispers in the dark, for intruders daring to trespass sacred halls. Yet no manual or drill could have prepared them for the tremor that ran through the palace when the Forbidden Wing was breached. Captain Elias Hart moved like a shadow among shadows, his boots muffled against the polished marble. The corridors stretched ahead, long and solemn, lit by the flickering chandeliers that cast trembling pools of golden light. Each step carried both authority and unease. Portraits of long, dead monarchs lined the walls, their eyes dark and accusing, the oil paint almost breathing in the candlelight. Somewhere in the distance, a clock told the hour, each chime a reminder that time itself bore witness to every unfolding choice. The alert had come swiftly, a breach in a wing so restricted that only those sworn to the highest oaths had ever walked its passages. The Forbidden Wing was more than a part of the palace. It was a living testament to centuries of lineage, secrecy, and devotion. Its doors had never been opened without ceremonial decree, and yet now the locks had been violated. Hart's fingers brushed the hilt of his sword, a nervous tick he had not allowed himself for years, as he surveyed his small patrol. 5 guards, each a mirror of his discipline, their faces masks of calm determination. Still, he felt the weight of what lay ahead pressing against his chest like the hull of a sinking ship. They entered the corridor, a tunnel of stone and memory. Dust motes floated in the wavering candlelight, and the scent of old varnish, wax, and iron lingered in the air. Hart's voice, low but unwavering, sliced through the silence. Keep formation, eyes open, every shadow matters. No one spoke beyond acknowledgement. The gravity of the moment rendered speech unnecessary. Each corridor seemed longer than it should have been, each turn more treacherous, as if the palace itself were conspiring to test their resolve. The first anomaly appeared in the Gallery of Ancestors. A draped tapestry had shifted, its weight uneven, corners lifted as though something had brushed past in haste. Hart's eyes narrowed. The echo of boots, defiant, unauthorized, must have passed this way. His hand hovered near the lock of an ancient door, etched with sigils marking it untouchable for generations. Touch it, and centuries of protocol demanded silence and oath, bound penance. Leave it, and the intruder could still advance. The moral dilemma crystallized instantly. Action carried risk. Inaction invited disaster. A distant clatter startled the patrol. Candles quivered, throwing grotesque shadows that danced along the walls. Hart signaled them to halt, pressing a finger to his lips. The sound was faint, too deliberate to be a mouse, too casual to be clumsy armor. But their instincts, honed through relentless training, told them it was the first true signal of intrusion. A hush fell over the guards, each straining to hear. Hart's own heartbeat seemed to echo in the marble-lined hall, a drumbeat in time with approaching danger. They moved forward, each step measured, almost ritualistic. Hart's mind catalogued possibilities: theft, sabotage, or something more arcane. The Forbidden Wing had always been more than storage or ceremony. It held objects that carried symbolic power, items that could inspire loyalty or provoke betrayal. His thoughts flickered to the Queen's coronation crown, the centerpiece of the Forbidden Wing, whose gold and jewels were said to radiate a presence beyond mere ornamentation. The patrol had orders: never touch, never approach unless absolutely necessary, never provoke the spirits of tradition. Yet already, in the dim corridor, Hart sensed the Crown's presence pulling him forward, demanding vigilance not only of body but of conscience. As they reached the heart of the wing, the light changed. Shadows pooled like ink in the corners, and the air thickened with a subtle, metallic tang. Hart gestured, and the patrol fanned out cautiously, their movements synchronized with an unspoken rhythm of training and fear. The walls themselves seemed alive, whispering tales of past guards who had faced temptation and fallen. An oil lamp sputtered, and the flicker illuminated something unnatural, a faint glow seeping from beneath the pedestal where the crown rested. The coronation crown sat untouched. Its golden frame shimmered as if breathing, each jewel catching and refracting the candlelight in patterns that defied natural physics. Hart's breath caught in his throat. Awe mingled with dread. To touch it would be sacrilege. To leave it unobserved could be disaster. The moral weight pressed on him like the palace ceilings themselves. Oppressive, absolute, unavoidable. Behind him, the guards shifted. Their whispers were almost imperceptible, a mix of fear and reverence. It's still here, untouched. Another breathed, eyes wide. Hart's gaze remained fixed on the crown. There was power in restraint, he reminded himself, a test not of courage, but of fidelity. Centuries of protocol demanded that the crown's sanctity remain unviolated, yet the breach in the wing suggested someone, or something, was challenging that very rule. His pulse quickened, and a cold realization crept through him. The danger was no longer about thieves or vandals. It was about choices, loyalty, and the invisible weight of history itself. A subtle movement caught his peripheral vision. The crown's pedestal, carved from dark marble and adorned with ancestral inscriptions, bore a slight irregularity. The camera of his mind, the meticulous attention trained over decades, picked up an outline of a hidden seam almost invisible in the soft glow. His hand twitched, unwillingly drawn toward a secret that had remained concealed for centuries. Hart resisted, yet the eyes of every ancestor in the portraits lining the hall seemed to bore into him, silently urging discovery, silently testing his resolve. The patrol maintained formation, but tension rippled like a living thing through the air. One guard, younger, eager, and untested in the nuances of moral restraint, stepped slightly closer to the pedestal. Hart's whisper cut through the corridor like a blade. "Do not remember protocol." The words were not a command, but a plea, a reminder that honor and duty outweighed curiosity or fear. Hours seemed to stretch in the silence, yet time was measured in small revelations. The whisper of a tapestry, the slight shift in light, the cold draft brushing their faces. Hart's mind catalogued possibilities, recalling stories of prior breaches long forgotten in the ledgers. Whispers of betrayal hidden within ceremonial records. This was not mere theft. It was a message, a test, or perhaps an accident in timing, but one with moral implications that would echo beyond the night. Then, in the stillness, a faint draft whispered through the crown's pedestal. Hart froze. The patrol held their collective breath. The air smelled faintly of iron and dust, and the glow of the crown seemed to pulse gently, as if alive. Hart's instinct screamed, something is here, something hidden. His eyes scanned the walls, the floor, the intricate carvings framing the pedestal, and there, a subtle, almost imperceptible line in the marble, a seam misaligned with the symmetry of the rest. The crown's radiance fell across it, illuminating what might be a hidden passage. The moral calculus of the moment was immediate and brutal. Investigate and risk the wrath of centuries, old rules, or ignore and potentially allow a breach to spread. Hart's gaze swept over his patrol. Each man waited for a signal, but the weight of responsibility fell squarely on him. A sigh escaped, barely audible. "We proceed carefully," he whispered, and the words carried both command and confession. As they approached the pedestal, every footstep became a meditation in control. The shadows seemed to recoil from their presence, yet the glow of the crown drew them forward with quiet insistence. Hart's eyes lingered on the inscriptions surrounding the pedestal, names, dates, oaths carved into the marble, each a testament to loyalty, courage, and failure. He wondered, briefly, how many hands had reached this threshold before him, and how many had resisted. And in that instant he understood that history was not static. It tested the present as rigorously as it judged the past. The hidden seam beneath the pedestal offered a promise of answers and danger alike. Hart knelt slightly, his hand hovering near the edge without touching. The crown's glow reflected in his eyes, casting a golden halo that seemed to weigh upon him with centuries of expectation. Beyond the glow lay the unknown, a passage that might reveal secrets the palace had long guarded. Yet to enter was to gamble with sacred law, to risk personal honor and duty. He exhaled slowly, the chill of the corridor pressing against his resolve, and then a whisper of motion, too deliberate for wind, too precise for shadow. Something or someone lingered just beyond the veil of light. The patrol tensed. Hart's eyes scanned the walls, and for the first time, the forbidden wing did not feel like a place of history alone. It felt alive, aware, watching, waiting. He realized that the night had shifted from one of vigilance to one of confrontation, moral, spiritual, and tangible. The crown's radiance pulsed once more, softly, rhythmically, almost beckoning. Hart met the eyes of his patrol, nodding imperceptibly. "We proceed," he murmured again, and with that, they prepared to breach not just the corridor, but the mysteries that lay hidden within the palace's most forbidden heart. A subtle click resonated beneath the crown's pedestal, a hidden panel sliding almost imperceptibly into view. Hart's breath caught. Beyond the glow, a secret passage yawned, promising truths older and darker than any protocol could anticipate. And as the shadows of the forbidden wing deepened, the captain knew the night had only just begun. The hidden passage yawned before them, a narrow slit carved into centuries of stone, its edges worn smooth by time or deliberate craft. Hart's hand lingered at the threshold, feeling the chill of the air spilling from within. The glow of the coronation crown receded behind them, casting a golden halo that marked the edge of the known world. Beyond it lay darkness, the kind of darkness that tests discipline, tempts curiosity, and magnifies the smallest misstep into catastrophe. He motioned silently, signaling the patrol to advance. Each guard obeyed instinctively, their shadows melting into the blackened corridor like ink into water. The air smelled of damp earth, old wood, and the faint tang of something metallic. Hart's senses sharpened. He could hear his own heartbeat, the subtle scrape of armor against stone, the faint hum of energy radiating from the crown above. Every instinct screamed vigilance, every training drilled patience. The passage twisted abruptly, forcing them to squeeze through a narrower constriction. Hart felt the weight of the walls around him, the centuries of secrecy pressing against his back. Faint carvings adorned the stone, nearly invisible in the dim light, symbols that seemed almost alive, shifting subtly as though acknowledging their intrusion. He knelt to inspect one, brushing away dust to reveal what appeared to be a seal, faded and cracked but unmistakably ancient. A warning, perhaps, or an invitation. Hart could not be sure, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. A muffled sound echoed ahead, almost like the dragging of feet, but softer, cautious. Hart froze, raising a hand. The patrol stilled instantly, trained eyes scanning every shadow, every irregularity in the stone. "Stay silent," he whispered, the words barely carrying, yet absolute. The corridor stretched longer than memory or logic would allow. The walls seemed to pulse slightly in the dim glow, as if the palace itself were aware of their presence, observing their choice to breach its most sacred boundaries. Then, a sudden shift, a low, almost imperceptible vibration through the stone floor. Hart's instincts flared. Someone, or something, was moving beyond the immediate reach of the light. He gestured for the patrol to fan out, forming a perimeter as careful as the one in the forbidden wing itself. Every footstep became deliberate, measured, each breath a negotiation with fear. The passage widened into a chamber. The smell of aged parchment and incense mingled with the colder, metallic tang of the stone floor. Hart's eyes adjusted to reveal shelves carved directly into the walls, housing scrolls, ledgers, and objects wrapped in velvet. Dust coated every surface, yet signs of recent disturbance were undeniable. A ledger had been knocked askew, a scroll partially unrolled, a faint fingerprint pressed into the grime. Hart knelt, inspecting the disturbance. "Someone's been here," he murmured, voice low but firm. "Recently, perhaps while the wing was breached." The patrol's eyes darted nervously, scanning for traps or additional intruders. One guard, younger, whispered, "Could it be the palace historian?" Hart's gaze hardened. Speculation was dangerous. Protocol demanded observation, not conjecture. Yet he knew instinctively that whatever had occurred here was no accident. It carried purpose, intention, and perhaps betrayal. A sudden scrape echoed from the far corner of the chamber. Hart motioned to the patrol. Slowly, deliberately, they approached. There, almost blending with the stone wall, was a small alcove. Within, a single object rested, a pendant intricately carved and glowing faintly with an internal light, though its source was impossible to discern. Hart's pulse quickened. He recognized it immediately, an artifact tied to the crown itself, a relic said to record loyalty, or perhaps to expose it. To touch it would be forbidden. To leave it untouched could conceal a critical clue. Hart's fingers hovered over the artifact, a silent negotiation with centuries of law and oath. The patrol's eyes were wide, reflecting both fear and awe. One guard ventured a whisper, It calls to us." Hart's jaw tightened. Call or no, protocol demanded restraint. Yet every fiber of his being urged understanding. The moral tension of the forbidden wing, and now this hidden chamber pressed upon him like stone. History had its eyes upon him, and history would not forgive mistakes. Hours seemed to pass in silence, broken only by the occasional scrape or whispered warning. Hart moved deliberately through the chamber, cataloguing evidence. Fingerprints in dust, slight smudges along ledgers, the angle of disturbance in scrolls that should have been untouched. Every detail mattered, every shadow carried weight. The crown above, glowing softly in the forbidden wing, seemed almost like a heartbeat guiding him, a silent witness to every choice he made. Then, an unexpected sound, a voice, low and deliberate, echoing faintly through the corridor beyond the chamber. Hart froze, motioning for the patrol to halt. The words were nearly imperceptible, carried on the breath of the air itself. "You should not have come here." The echo dissolved as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the cold, tangible silence of the stone. Hart's jaw tightened. Whoever, or whatever, had spoken was testing them, confirming presence, asserting dominion over secrets long held sacred. The patrol exchanged subtle glances, tension coiling like a living thing among them. Hart's thoughts turned briefly to the Queen, to the crown, to the legacy of guardianship he carried on his shoulders. Every choice now bore consequences not just for the palace, but for the entire institution of loyalty and heritage. The weight was physical, pressing down on them, amplified by the oppressive shadows and the soft, beckoning glow of the crown that waited above. A draught stirred the chamber's dust, revealing another seam in the stone wall. Smaller, hidden, yet unmistakably a passage. Hart's eyes narrowed. He knew instinctively that this was more than a corridor, it was a test. Some secret, perhaps buried for centuries, was waiting just beyond the reach of light and law. The moral stakes of the night crystallized fully. Duty versus discovery, obedience versus the pursuit of truth. Every guard held their breath, waiting for his decision. Hart exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "We advance," he whispered. The words were calm, but the weight behind them was immense. Each step forward felt like a negotiation with history itself, a promise that every choice would be measured against centuries of law and honor. The patrol followed, shadows merging with stone as they entered the hidden passage. The corridor twisted and narrowed, light from the crown above fading into memory. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the scent of secrecy and the faint tang of iron. Hart's mind catalogued possibilities, a hidden room, an ancient trap, perhaps records or relics the palace had deliberately concealed. Every instinct demanded caution, yet the pull of discovery was irresistible. The forbidden wing had revealed one secret. This hidden passage promised many more. Finally, the passage opened into a small chamber, walls lined with shelves of scrolls and ledgers, jars containing herbs and powders long forgotten. A single candle flickered on a stone pedestal, revealing the remnants of an intruder's work. Scattered papers, an overturned ink pot, and a small, intricately carved box, sealed but ancient. Hart approached cautiously, noting every detail. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for acknowledgement, for the next move, for the moral decision that could alter history. Hart knelt, examining the box. Faint inscriptions, worn by time, spoke of loyalty, betrayal, and oath. Bound secrecy. His hand hovered, unwilling to break the seal, yet compelled by necessity. The glow of the crown above, barely visible through the narrowing corridor, seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, as if measuring the gravity of the choice. Finally, he stepped back. To touch prematurely would violate protocol. To leave it alone might forfeit the truth. The patrol waited, the weight of centuries pressing in. In that moment, Hart understood fully the essence of the night. It was not merely about intruders, theft, or shadowed halls. It was about choices, the silent testing of integrity, and the living presence of history itself. Hart's gaze returned briefly to the crown's pedestal above. Beyond the glow, the hidden seam, and the artifacts within the passage promised truths far older than the night itself. As the patrol prepared to document every discovery and return to the main wing, a shadow moved at the corner of his eye, a subtle, deliberate motion that suggested the palace held one more secret, waiting for the right hand to uncover it. The breach had begun, but its full story was only just awakening. The forbidden wing had quieted once more, yet the echoes of the midnight breach lingered in the corners, settling like dust over every ledge and carving. Captain Elias Hart moved deliberately through the restored halls, every footfall measured, every glance catalogued. The glow of the coronation crown, now distant yet persistent in his mind, seemed to follow him. Reminder that the palace held both history and expectation, and that secrets were not merely objects, but moral tests. Hart paused at the entrance to the archive chamber, his hand brushing over the smooth stone walls. The hidden passage they had discovered in the heart of the wing whispered of centuries of secrecy, but now a new task demanded his attention: methodical investigation. Not instinct alone, but protocol, precedent, and rigorous observation. He instructed his patrol to secure the corridor, their discipline unwavering even as tension simmered beneath every disciplined gesture. The chamber itself was vast, a cathedral of knowledge hidden beneath the palace's polished halls. Shelves rose toward vaulted ceilings, stacked with ledgers, scrolls, and meticulously catalogued objects. each labeled in faded ink. The air smelled of old parchment, beeswax, and the faint tang of iron, a combination that spoke of longevity and vigilance. Hart's fingers traced the spines of books as he moved, noting the slight misalignments in the rows. Dust patterns revealed recent activity. A ledger shifted, a ribbon displaced, a footprint pressed faintly into the waxed floor. Every anomaly carried significance. He opened the first ledger with care. The pages were brittle, filled with codes, ciphers, and ceremonial notations. Hart's eyes scanned line after line, cross-referencing dates and signatures with the palace's archival records. A discrepancy appeared almost immediately, a series of entries marked by an unfamiliar hand, written in an ink darker than any recorded before. The ledger detailed ceremonial transfers of relics and artifacts, yet this new script hinted at deliberate obfuscation. Whoever had entered the Forbidden Wing had knowledge of both protocol and loopholes. Hart's mind catalogued possibilities. This was no random intrusion. It was precise, informed, and deliberate. He considered the implications for loyalty, for hierarchy, for the centuries of oath-bound service. The palace did not simply guard objects. It guarded knowledge, precedent, and moral precedent. Any breach, therefore, was not just physical, but philosophical. The crown's untouched glow in the Forbidden Wing now seemed almost sentient, a witness to human choice and misstep. Hours passed as Hart moved systematically through the archive chamber, examining ledgers, cross-checking with codified correspondences, and cataloging disturbances. Each object, each scroll, was a puzzle piece, revealing a web of interlocking secrets. Historical tapestries lining the walls depicted coronations and ceremonies long forgotten. In the shadowed folds, subtle details hinted at past compromises and clandestine alliances. A ceremonial scepter leaned against the wall, its gold dulled by time, yet the engraving suggested a lineage of loyalty tested and occasionally broken. Hart noted these visual cues, understanding that history spoke not only through records, but through objects and gestures preserved in silence. A faint rustle drew his attention. Hart's patrol had spread throughout the chamber, maintaining a silent perimeter. One guard, the youngest, crouched beside a ledger, brushing dust carefully aside. Hart approached, noticing that the guard's fingers had uncovered a small, folded note, nearly invisible beneath the faded ribbon. He took it gently, careful not to disturb its placement. The paper was brittle, ink almost erased, yet the message was clear, a cipher indicating unauthorized access, coupled with initials that did not appear in any official register. Hart's pulse quickened. An insider, someone with knowledge of both protocol and palace hierarchy. The moral weight of the discovery pressed down immediately. The palace guard was built on trust, loyalty, and the unbroken chain of command. The very idea that a member of this chain might be compromised threatened not only the integrity of the institution, but the safety of the crown itself. Hart catalogued the note carefully, memorizing the peculiar curves of the handwriting, the subtle choice of cipher, and the placement within the ledger. Every detail mattered. Every anomaly was a thread that might unravel centuries of order. He moved to examine the adjacent shelves, revealing a trove of coded correspondences, letters between high-ranking officials, ceremonial advisors, and even foreign dignitaries. Each envelope was sealed with wax, bearing insignias that had not changed for decades. Yet subtle differences were apparent, a broken seal here, a smudge there, a slight shift in the wax color indicating recent tampering. Hart's eyes narrowed. The palace hierarchy had mechanisms for detection, yet this intrusion had evaded them, suggesting both knowledge and intention. The patrol observed silently, each guard a testament to restraint and discipline. Hart's mind wandered briefly to the Queen's coronation crown, now glowing faintly in memory. Its presence was a silent moral arbiter, illuminating both human fidelity and failure. Every action within the Forbidden Wing, every anomaly in the archives, seemed to pulse with the same quiet authority. Hart realized that the investigation itself was a moral exercise. Patience, observation, and meticulous documentation were not only tactical imperatives, but ceremonial obligations, binding the present to the weight of history. He turned to an archival portrait, an oil painting of a monarch long deceased. The eyes of the figure, dark and piercing, seemed to follow him. In that gaze, Hart sensed judgment, not punitive, but expectant. The monarch had entrusted the palace to generations of guardians, and now, through subtle signs and fractured protocols, the test continued. Hart understood fully. This investigation was more than an accounting of events. It was a measure of moral fidelity. Hours drifted into a rhythm. Hart examined ledgers, aligned correspondences, and noted inconsistencies. He recorded every irregularity, catalogued every disturbance, and cross-referenced anomalies with ceremonial records. Dust, fingerprints, ink stains, and misaligned scrolls became pieces of a narrative that the palace itself had begun to write, deliberately, for those perceptive enough to read it. Then a subtle realization: some doors in the Forbidden Wing, previously considered unbreachable, bore marks of recent tampering. Hinges misaligned, faint scratches on the stone, and the imperceptible scent of oil used in lock mechanisms. These were not signs of force, but knowledge. Someone with access, or understanding, had moved through these spaces with purpose. Hart's pulse quickened. The breach had been internal, calculated, and deliberate. The moral implications were profound. The enemy was not a stranger, but potentially someone sworn to protect the crown. Hart called his patrol together, their shadows long and tense under the vaulted ceiling. "Document everything. Nothing is too small," he instructed, voice low but unwavering. Every movement, every observed detail became part of a record, a shield against further violations. The patrol understood implicitly. This was no ordinary investigation. Every ledger, every ciphered note, every displaced scroll was a test of judgment, a challenge to loyalty, and a reflection of the palace's enduring code. He lingered on a shelf of ancient scrolls, each carefully rolled and sealed. One, however, had been partially unrolled, revealing symbols not immediately recognizable. Hart examined them carefully, tracing each character with his eyes. The symbols were ceremonial, but also suggestive of a coded system designed to conceal information even from those trained in palace protocol. Hart's mind raced. Whoever had accessed these scrolls had knowledge that transcended ordinary training. An insider, or someone who had learned the codes over time. The patrol noted the faint pressure marks on the floor, a subtle trail indicating movement through the chamber. Hart followed these, observing how the intruder, or intruders, had handled each object minimally, deliberately, almost reverently. This was not theft. It was examination, selection, and perhaps preparation. The crown's influence seemed to extend even here, a silent arbiter, marking choices and testing resolve. A faint whisper of wind shifted a corner of parchment, and Hart bent to secure it. Beneath it lay a small emblem, partially obscured, etched with symbols matching those on the pedestal of the coronation crown. He froze. The connection was undeniable. Whoever had entered the Forbidden Wing had sought not only physical access, but symbolic alignment. The crown itself, long revered, was now implicated in this chain of clandestine intent. Hart's thoughts returned to protocol, to oaths, to centuries of institutional memory. The palace was more than stone and gold. It was a living organism, sustained by vigilance, fidelity, and restraint. Each anomaly uncovered in the archives was a heartbeat in its body, a warning signal, a moral test. To ignore any discrepancy, to bypass a subtle mark of intent, was to risk destabilizing centuries of order. He straightened, addressing his patrol. "We continue carefully. Every detail, every mark, every symbol matters. Record it, catalogue it, and observe the flow of movement." The guards nodded silently. Their discipline was flawless, yet Hart sensed undercurrents of tension. The awareness that the breach was more than an isolated incident, that someone within the palace walls might now be actively undermining the sanctity of their duty. And yet, amidst the methodical process, a faint glimmer of understanding emerged. History, he realized, had left clues deliberately. The ledgers, the correspondences, the coded symbols, they were all part of a continuum, a puzzle of centuries, awaiting recognition by one willing to observe, to weigh, and to act with both intelligence and restraint. Hart understood that the investigation was not merely procedural. It was philosophical, moral, and deeply personal. Among the ledgers, a folded note slipped from between two pages, its edges frayed, ink faint but deliberate. Hart recognized the handwriting, part familiar, part elusive, and understood immediately this was no mere breach. Someone inside the palace had acted, and the consequences of trust, loyalty, and secrecy would ripple through the halls like a shadow with its own intent. The investigation had only just begun, and the true test of fidelity awaited in the layers of deception now quietly unfolding. The folded note rested in Captain Hart's hands, fragile and almost ethereal under the candlelight of the archive chamber. Its edges were frayed, the ink faded but deliberate, forming letters and numbers that defied immediate comprehension. Hart's eyes traced the patterns slowly, the methodical rhythm of his mind aligning with centuries of palace procedure. Whoever had written this note had intimate knowledge of both the Forbidden Wing and the intricate hierarchy of the Royal Guard. Someone close, someone trusted. He turned to the patrol, their faces taut with the same mix of curiosity and restrained alarm he felt himself. No words were needed. The moral weight of the discovery was evident in the stiff posture, in the careful handling of every ledger, scroll, and artifact. Hart's mind catalogued the implications. Trust was fractured, loyalty questioned, and the sanctity of the crown, untouched yet undeniably threatened, hung over them like a silent judge. Hart carefully unfolded the note completely, revealing a coded sequence interlaced with a simple message. Not all who guard are faithful. The handwriting was precise, meticulous, unmistakably belonging to someone trained in the palace's ceremonial discipline, yet the small idiosyncrasies, the curl of an S, the slant of an H, suggested a hand that had learned subtle ways to conceal intent. Hart's pulse quickened. A traitor among those sworn to protect the crown was not a theory, it was reality. He stepped deeper into the chamber, placing the note on a flat stone pedestal, its surface worn smooth by decades of ceremonial use. The patrol spread out, examining ledgers, scrolls, and objects with a rigor that bordered on reverence. Dust was brushed aside, fingerprints catalogued, and minor disturbances noted in meticulous detail. Hart's mind raced. The palace was a labyrinth of information, and every anomaly now carried significance. The breach was no longer an abstract problem. It was an intricate puzzle of loyalty, secrecy, and human ambition. Among the ledgers, Hart discovered a faint pattern. A series of ceremonial records had been altered subtly over the past month, dates shifted, notations adjusted, and names overwritten. The changes were nearly imperceptible, requiring the trained eye and knowledge of centuries of protocol to detect. Hart's breath caught. Someone had been preparing for this, slowly undermining the structure of trust from within. The palace hierarchy itself had been probed, tested, and exploited. He gestured to the patrol, guiding them to examine the more delicate ledgers. each with fragile pages containing coded correspondence. They noted the subtle variations in wax seals, the faint impressions of letters pressed into the parchment, and the almost imperceptible smudges suggesting recent handling. Hart recorded each finding carefully. This investigation was no longer about discovery alone. It was about constructing a map of intent, charting the movements and choices of someone who had infiltrated their sacred trust. The chamber's architecture seemed to respond to the tension, the vaulted ceilings amplifying the faintest sounds. The scratch of ink on paper, the rustle of fabric, the whisper of a candle's flame. Hart's gaze fell on an ancient tapestry depicting a coronation scene. The scene itself was ceremonial, frozen in oil and brushstrokes, yet subtle details caught his attention. The orientation of guards, the positioning of relics, even the gestures of courtiers suggested intentional messaging. Symbols repeated across the tapestry mirrored those in the scrolls he had catalogued, hinting at a code encoded across generations. Hart stepped closer, tracing the patterns with his eyes, letting the mind trained in both martial discipline and ceremonial tradition work. The message was clear. The breach had significance beyond immediate threat. It was a test, a demonstration, and a warning all at once. The palace itself, through centuries of recorded protocol, was speaking, and the insider had listened carefully. Every movement within these halls now had weight, every choice measured against the unseen arbiter of loyalty and consequence. A soft creak echoed through the chamber. Hart's attention snapped to the sound. A shadow moved at the far end of the corridor, subtle yet deliberate. The patrol shifted slightly, instincts honed over years springing to alertness. Hart held a hand up, signaling patience. The movement did not repeat. Yet the moral tension of the moment was absolute. The palace held secrets, the insider had already acted, and one wrong step could unravel centuries of order. Hart returned to the ledgers, referencing the coded notes against ceremonial calendars, duty rosters, and historical records. Each anomaly reinforced the same conclusion. The breach was not a random act. It was a calculated insider maneuver. Someone with knowledge of palace rhythms, who understood the limits of trust, had tested the boundaries of loyalty. Hart's mind catalogued names, faces, and ranks. The probability narrowed. This was not a casual intruder, but a member of the royal guard or close advisory circle. He paused to consider the implications. Loyalty, he reflected, was both tangible and invisible. The crown itself had always been a symbol of fidelity, but symbols were only as strong as those who bore witness. The breach was now a reflection of human ambition, a test of moral integrity. The glowing crown, distant yet omnipresent in Hart's memory, seemed to mark the stakes, a silent arbiter measuring not the gold or jewels, but the choices of those sworn to protect it. Hours passed in methodical investigation. Ledgers were documented, anomalies recorded, and patrol notes compiled with precision. Hart noted every deviation from protocol, every symbol misaligned, every letter smudged. Even the smallest detail, a wax seal pressed slightly askew, became a critical clue. The palace itself seemed to breathe, each corridor, alcove, and chamber alive with the weight of history and expectation. Then, among the ledgers, Hart discovered a particularly troubling note, concealed in a folded corner, nearly invisible beneath a stack of ceremonial records. The handwriting was deliberate, familiar, yet the message was subtle. Watch the young guard, not all are as they appear. Hart's jaw tightened. The note was a warning, a nudge, and an accusation all at once. Someone close, possibly trusted, had orchestrated part of the breach, or at least had foreknowledge. Suspicion now extended into the patrol itself, a corrosive tension that would test every bond, every oath, every silent agreement maintained over centuries. He gathered the patrol around. their shadows long and tense under the flickering candlelight. Hart spoke quietly, the weight of authority tempered by the gravity of revelation. The breach was not random. Someone inside has acted or is about to. Trust is no longer absolute. Document, observe, and do not act without evidence. Loyalty will be tested, so will judgment. Each word carried the resonance of centuries of ceremonial expectation, and the patrol absorbed it, disciplined, attentive, yet aware of the unseen tension threading through their ranks. The chamber held its breath. Scrolls and ledgers lined the walls like silent witnesses, their presence a constant reminder that history was not inert. The crown above, glowing faintly in Hart's memory, seemed to pulse in rhythm with the revelation. Secrets concealed, intentions revealed, and moral stakes climbing higher with every observation. Hart felt the weight of responsibility like the stone ceiling above him, imposing, inevitable, unavoidable. He returned to the ledger containing the initial insider note, comparing it carefully with the patterns revealed elsewhere. Dates, initials, coded references, all converged on a pattern suggesting deliberate manipulation, as if someone had orchestrated a test of protocol, using the breach as both cover and message. Hart's pulse quickened. The palace's hierarchy, its centuries of ceremonial order, was under quiet siege, and yet the crown remained untouched, its glow a constant, almost sentient, reminder of what was at stake. Finally, Hart stepped back, cataloguing the discoveries: tampered doors, shifted ledgers, coded notes, and subtle physical traces. Each anomaly was a piece of the puzzle, revealing both intent and opportunity. The insider threat was now clear. Someone within the palace's trusted circle had acted deliberately, their knowledge of protocol making them a dangerous and unpredictable presence. Hart's mind raced. The next steps would require precision, strategy, and unflinching moral clarity. Hart's eyes rested on the folded note once more. The handwriting, the coded symbols, the placement, all pointed to one conclusion. The breach had been orchestrated from within, and the shadow of betrayal now stretched across the palace walls. As he prepared to trace the trail further, the weight of centuries pressed down. Loyalty would be questioned, secrets exposed, and the true test of fidelity had only just begun. Beyond the ledgers and cryptic correspondences, the next revelation waited, subtle, deliberate, and capable of reshaping every bond sworn to the crown. The corridors of the palace felt different now. The hush of routine had been replaced by a subtle tension, a low hum of unease vibrating through every marble wall and gilded banister. Captain Elias Hart moved carefully, each step measured, aware that the breach in the forbidden wing had shifted the equilibrium of loyalty and trust. His patrol followed, silent and vigilant, their shadows stretching like long fingers across the polished floors. In the distance, the faint glow of the coronation crown lingered in his memory, a silent reminder of both sacred duty and the weight of history. Hart's mind churned with questions. Who had orchestrated the breach? Was it ambition, curiosity, or something darker? And now, after the ledger notes and cryptic ciphers, one truth was undeniable. Suspicion had fractured the very hierarchy he had relied upon for decades. Loyalty was no longer implicit. It had to be tested, observed, and verified. The palace, once a place of order and ritual, now felt like a labyrinth of concealed motives, hidden glances, and whispered doubts. He entered the first council room, its heavy doors creaking in protest. Inside, advisors and senior guards had gathered, their faces taut with controlled tension. The historian, an elderly man whose memory of past coronations was near sacred, stood near a table cluttered with ledgers and notes. His eyes, normally serene, flicked toward Hart with something between concern and accusation. "Captain Hart," he began cautiously, "you've uncovered something unsettling, I presume." Hart's response was measured. The breach in the forbidden wing was deliberate. Evidence points to someone with knowledge of our protocols, someone inside the palace. The historian's brow furrowed. The room went quiet, the weight of implication pressing down like the vaulted ceilings above. Guards shifted uneasily, and the younger ones avoided eye contact, as though the mere gaze of their superiors might betray hidden intentions. A junior guard, barely past his 20th year, whispered from the back, "Could it be one of us?" His words were almost inaudible, yet they hung in the air like smoke, permeating every corner of the room. Hart's gaze swept over the assembly. Every man and woman was trained, oath, bound and disciplined. But now, in the light of suspicion, each face carried the possibility of deceit. The moral tension was immediate and sharp. Trust was fragile, yet absolute vigilance was required. The historian cleared his throat, voice steady but laced with emotion. The crown has always been more than an object. It tests those who serve it. Perhaps this is not merely a breach of protocol, but a trial of loyalty. Hart considered the words carefully. There was wisdom in them, but also danger. To frame the intrusion as a test could obscure the human element. The deliberate choice of someone close to manipulate, to deceive, to betray. Hart motioned for a demonstration. The ledgers and cryptic notes were laid across the table, and he began a careful explanation of the evidence. Tampered ledgers, misaligned seals, and ciphers pointing to insider involvement. The council listened, some nodding, some frowning, others remaining impassive. Each gesture, each subtle movement, carried significance. In the palace, even the smallest action could indicate alignment or opposition. A subtle tension arose when the younger guards were instructed to verify the sequences of entries in the ledgers. One of them hesitated, eyes flicking toward a more senior officer. Hart noticed the brief hesitation, cataloguing it. Trust, he realized, had become a landscape of micro-expressions and fleeting gestures, each demanding scrutiny without breaking protocol. One misstep, one whispered suggestion, could ignite suspicion, and the palace would crumble under the weight of fractured allegiance. As Hart continued, the historian interjected, voice tinged with urgency. The crown chooses its witnesses carefully. It has always revealed truths not by force, but by subtle signs, shifts in attention, misalignments in ceremony, anomalies in conduct. Perhaps the breach is the crown's way of revealing the hidden. Hart nodded, aware of the moral weight in the statement. The crown's influence was both symbolic and tangible, a presence that extended beyond its physical form, shaping decisions, testing fidelity, and illuminating deception. Dialogue flowed into tensioned debate. Advisors questioned the security protocols. How could someone move unnoticed? Guards argued over the interpretation of ledger discrepancies. Hart listened carefully, weighing each perspective, interjecting with calm authority when necessary. The chamber was alive with the friction of duty and doubt, a space where allegiance was both demonstrated and interrogated simultaneously. Every spoken word was a measure of loyalty, every silent pause a signal. The discussion shifted toward the younger guard, implicated subtly in Hart's observations. Hart's gaze met the guard's, noting the brief flicker of recognition, the avoidance of eye contact. "You were near the ledger when the anomaly was discovered," Hart stated, calm yet piercing. The guard's jaw tightened. I only noticed it," he stammered. "I didn't touch it." Hart studied the micro-expressions, the nervous twitch in the fingers, the subtle shifts in posture. The palace had taught him to read these moments as precisely as any document. Trust was fragile. Loyalty was now a question, not an assumption. Hours passed as the council debated, and Hart moved between observation and documentation. The palace itself seemed to lean in, stone walls echoing soft whispers, portraits of past monarchs casting long shadows that flickered in the candlelight. Every detail mattered: the precise placement of ledgers, the alignment of ceremonial symbols, even the angle at which advisors held their pens. In this microcosm of palace life, the threads of betrayal were subtle, almost invisible, yet unmistakable to those trained to see them. Finally, the historian spoke again, voice low, commanding attention. The Crown has always revealed secrets in stages. This breach, this act, is part of a continuum. Past betrayals, misaligned loyalties, unrecorded decisions. They all converge here. The Crown watches, and it tests the living as much as it preserves the dead. Hart's eyes swept across the room. The room's tension had deepened. Silence now pressed against the walls, a living thing. The Crown's glow, distant in memory yet ever present in thought, seemed to mark the stakes of every word, every hesitation, every glance. Hart directed the guards to trace movements within the Forbidden Wing and the archive chamber, comparing them to duty rosters and access logs. Patterns emerged: subtle shifts in patrol routes, entries recorded but not verified, doors slightly ajar. The internal evidence suggested a coordinated action, a deliberate manipulation of both protocol and observation. The weight of realization struck Hart fully. This was no ordinary breach. The palace's very hierarchy was under scrutiny, tested by the unseen hand of someone close, someone trusted. The younger guard, now visibly tense, whispered to a colleague, "What if they already know? What if they're watching us?" Hart's eyes met his, steady and unyielding. "Then we act as we must," he replied. His voice carried authority, but also moral gravity. In the palace, every action was both tactical and ethical. Hesitation could invite disaster, yet rashness could betray trust irreversibly. The council's deliberations stretched into the night. Each revelation, each observation was carefully weighed, dissected, and recorded. Hart documented everything, understanding that history would remember not only the breach itself but the moral and procedural response to it. He reviewed ledger anomalies, examined misaligned seals, and noted every sign of deliberate interference. Suspicion was now a living presence within the walls, fracturing certainty, compelling scrutiny, and shaping every decision. A soft knock echoed from the chamber's entrance, startling the council. Hart's eyes narrowed. The palace was no longer a predictable environment. Every sound, shadow, and movement carried possible significance. A messenger, pale and hesitant, stepped forward, carrying a small parcel. Hart opened it carefully, revealing another note, cryptic yet unmistakable. "Trust is measured, not given. Watch carefully who guards the crown." The handwriting, subtle yet deliberate, suggested the same insider, the same hand testing boundaries. The moral tension in the room tightened like a coiled spring. Hart folded the note deliberately, cataloguing it alongside previous anomalies. The patrol tightened around the chamber, their disciplined presence a reminder of the palace's vigilance. Every ledger, every cryptic message, every shadowed gesture was a piece of a growing puzzle, revealing not only the breach but the deeper fractures of allegiance. Hart's eyes returned to the portraits lining the walls, monarchs long deceased, silent witnesses to centuries of loyalty and betrayal. Somewhere within the palace, someone close had orchestrated the breach, testing not just protocol, but the moral fiber of the royal guard. The next step was clear: interrogate, uncover motives, and navigate the delicate tension between duty and human ambition. The shadows of allegiance were deepening, and the crown's silent glow promised that the night's revelations were only beginning. The council chamber had emptied, leaving only Captain Hart and his patrol in the soft glow of candlelight. The palace seemed to breathe around them, the shadows long and shifting across the walls lined with portraits of monarchs and generals long gone. Each flicker of the flame threw a new expression across the faces of painted ancestors, as though the past itself were observing, weighing every decision, every hesitation, every suspicion. Hart returned to the ledger table, where notes, ciphers, and small anomalies had been gathered meticulously over the course of hours. His eyes scanned the patterns once more, the pieces of the puzzle arranging themselves slowly into a picture he had not wanted to see. Someone close to the crown, someone within the trusted circle, was orchestrating more than a breach. They were manipulating perception, controlling what the guards and advisors saw, shaping events from the shadows. A subtle noise drew his attention. From the corner of the chamber, a figure emerged, pale, tense, and hesitant. It was the palace historian, eyes darting as though the flickering candlelight might reveal more than just faces. "Captain Hart," he said quietly, "there is something you must see. Something hidden, overlooked in the ledgers and scrolls." Hart gestured for the historian to proceed. The old man produced a small leather-bound diary, its cover worn and edges frayed. It was kept by one of the Queen's closest advisors. He explained, voice trembling slightly. "It contains records, confessions, observations, even intentions that were never meant to see daylight. But in light of the breach, I believe it may reveal the truth behind the events unfolding in the palace." Hart opened the diary cautiously. The pages were dense with meticulous handwriting, some entries almost illegible from time and age. Yet a pattern emerged immediately: names, dates, sequences of events, and subtle indications of manipulation. Each entry detailed movements, decisions, and reactions, both observed and orchestrated, pointing towards someone who had not only breached the forbidden wing, but had guided the reactions of the guards and advisors deliberately. The moral gravity pressed down. The crown's sanctity had been challenged by one sworn to protect it. The younger guard shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight of revelation pressing against the walls. "Sir," he whispered, "are you saying, 'Someone here'?" Hart nodded slowly, his gaze intense. "Yes, someone among us has acted with intention, calculated to test loyalty, evade suspicion, and control perception. The consequences are profound." Hart traced the entries carefully, noting subtle repetitions, misaligned patrols, overlooked ledger anomalies, and quiet manipulations of ceremonial procedure. The diary's author had documented these acts with clinical precision, leaving behind a trail of evidence intended only for the eyes of the crown, or perhaps for someone willing to seek the truth. Hart realized the diary itself was a test, a moral gauntlet, asking him and his patrol to weigh evidence, verify details, and confront uncomfortable truths. A tension rose in the chamber as Hart addressed his patrol. "This is no longer merely a matter of investigation. The crown, the palace, and the institution of loyalty itself are at risk. We must proceed with caution. Every assumption must be verified, every action deliberate, every trust earned." The guards absorbed his words, each aware that the night's revelations demanded both vigilance and moral clarity. The historian's eyes flicked toward a nearby tapestry depicting a past coronation. "Do you see the positioning of the guards?" he asked, voice barely audible. Even then, centuries ago, the crown tested loyalty. Betrayals were recorded in subtle gestures, in the orientation of hands, in the alignment of objects. This breach, this is history repeating itself, in a way the palace has rarely allowed us to witness. Hart studied the tapestry, noticing details previously overlooked. A subtle tilt of a ceremonial sword, a guard positioned slightly off-center, a hand extended toward an advisor whose loyalty was later questioned. These details, once considered minor, now appeared as markers, messages left across time to guide those attentive enough to read them. The palace was not merely a building, it was a living repository of moral instruction, encoded in stone, paint, and ritual. The conversation shifted as the diary revealed a startling clue. The handwriting on some entries matched that of a current member of the Queen's advisory circle, a figure respected and trusted, yet now implicated in subtle acts of manipulation. Hart's pulse quickened. The crown's silent glow, the carefully orchestrated movement of guards, and the coded notes all pointed toward this individual. A confrontation would be necessary, but the moral stakes were staggering. Accuse the wrong person, and centuries of trust could unravel. Fail to act, and the crown itself might be compromised. Hart motioned for the patrol to document all findings, preserving the diary, ledger anomalies, and coded notes. Every detail was critical. The palace demanded both caution and precision, and the breach had elevated the stakes to a level that required moral and procedural perfection. As the guards worked silently, Hart allowed himself a moment of reflection. The crown had always tested those who served it, but now the test had become immediate, personal, and unavoidable. A sudden knock at the chamber door interrupted the quiet. Hart's hand went instinctively to the hilt of his ceremonial sword, eyes narrowing. The door creaked open, revealing a messenger carrying another folded note, smaller than the rest but deliberately placed, as if to ensure discovery. Hart took it carefully. The note was simple. The crown chooses its observers. Trust will fracture. The loyal will be revealed. Hart's mind catalogued the implications immediately. The message confirmed the growing realization this breach was more than an act of curiosity or ambition. It was a deliberate moral trial orchestrated by someone skilled, someone within the palace, and someone testing the limits of both procedure and loyalty. The shadows of allegiance had deepened. The investigation was no longer merely about discovery, but judgment. He turned to the historian. The diary, the notes, the ledger discrepancies, they all point towards someone orchestrating events from within. We must confront them carefully without breaching protocol. Every action we take will be scrutinized not just by the palace, but by history itself. The historian nodded gravely, understanding the weight of Hart's words. Hart spent the remainder of the night tracing patterns, cross-referencing entries, and cataloging anomalies. Doors previously assumed secure bore subtle signs of tampering. Patrol rotations were slightly misaligned. Coded correspondences suggested foreknowledge of each step. Every detail reinforced the same conclusion. The breach was carefully planned, morally calculated, and executed by someone whose loyalty was now under question. As dawn approached, the chamber's shadows lengthened, stretching across the ledgers, the diary, and the tapestry. Hart surveyed the room, feeling the full weight of responsibility pressing down. Every decision from this point forward required perfect balance, discipline tempered with intuition, investigation coupled with moral clarity. Loyalty could no longer be assumed. It had to be tested, verified, and understood. Finally, Hart returned to the concealed diary, placing it alongside the ledger and cryptic notes. He stared at the handwriting, tracing the familiar curves with his eyes. A single thought crystallized. Betrayal was close, deliberate, and intimately connected to the crown itself. The palace's centuries-old hierarchy was now under moral siege, and the coming confrontation would determine not only the outcome of the investigation, but the fate of trust within the royal guard. Hart's gaze lifted to the portraits lining the chamber walls. The monarchs, silent witnesses for centuries, seemed to watch as the first threads of betrayal revealed themselves. Somewhere within the palace, a trusted hand had orchestrated the breach, manipulating perception and testing loyalty. Ahead lay confrontation, revelation, and the full moral reckoning of the crown's guardians. The shadows of allegiance were no longer abstract. They were immediate, deliberate, and inescapable. The palace felt colder in the early hours, the marble floors reflecting a muted, silver light from the crescent moon. Shadows stretched across halls long accustomed to the discipline of routine, but now those shadows seemed alive, carrying whispers of uncertainty and quiet judgment. Captain Elias Hart moved silently through the corridors, his footsteps measured, mindful of every creak, every echo. The midnight breach and its revelations had left the air heavy with suspicion. The once familiar corridors now held the weight of potential betrayal. The glow of the coronation crown, once a distant memory of the forbidden wing, lingered in Hart's mind. It was not merely a relic. It was a moral compass, an unblinking witness to choices and intentions. Its untouched brilliance seemed to mark both fault and fidelity, illuminating the tension that now gripped the palace. Hart understood that the breach was not simply physical. It was ethical, psychological, and symbolic. Every decision, every observation, and every silence now carried moral significance. Hart paused at the threshold of a rarely used chamber. The air was stale, a mixture of old parchment, waxed stone, and the faint trace of iron, a reminder of centuries of vigilance. He traced his fingers along the carved frames of ancestral portraits lining the walls, eyes following the gaze of kings, queens, and generals long gone. Their painted eyes seemed to measure him, to weigh the burden he carried. Betrayal, he realized, was not only an act of the present, but a violation of the memory of those who had upheld duty for generations. Inside the chamber, the historian waited. His expression was grave, lines of age deepened by worry. "Captain," he said softly, "the diary you uncovered. It reveals more than a breach. It shows deliberate manipulation, carefully orchestrated to test loyalty, control perception, and erode trust from within. The act is not only treacherous, it is personal." Hart nodded, absorbing the weight of the statement. He knew that confronting the insider would be dangerous, not merely for physical security, but for the moral fabric of the royal guard. Loyalty was not a simple matter of obedience. It was a covenant, a promise bound across generations. To breach that trust was to undermine centuries of discipline and devotion. They moved carefully through the chamber, examining ledgers, letters, and artifacts that had been disturbed or manipulated. The diary's revelations were subtle but damning. Entries suggested calculated actions, orchestrated misalignments in patrols, and even subtle nudges to influence the decisions of guards and advisors. Every detail was a thread, weaving a story of ambition, deceit, and moral compromise. Hart paused before a ceremonial sword, its blade dull yet gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The hilt was engraved with inscriptions celebrating loyalty, valor, and service. Now, in the context of the breach, the sword seemed a cruel irony, a symbol of integrity overshadowed by the reality of treachery. He ran a gloved hand along the metal, feeling the weight of legacy pressing against him. Betrayal was not only an act, it was an ethical wound, a rupture in the continuity of history that demanded recognition and response. The younger guards hovered nearby, uneasy in the silence. One spoke, voice barely above a whisper, "Captain, what do we do if the traitor is one of us?" Hart's gaze met theirs, steady and unyielding. "We act with discernment. Discipline must guide judgment. Evidence, not suspicion, will determine action. The weight of betrayal is heavy, but so is the responsibility to uphold trust where it remains." A soft rustle from the corner drew Hart's attention. It was a ledger, displaced slightly from the others, as if recently examined. He opened it with care. The pages revealed subtle annotations, marks of someone who had been in the chamber, following protocol with precision yet leaving behind clues for those attentive enough to see. The handwriting matched the diary entries, confirming the presence of an insider carefully testing every guard, every procedure, every oath-bound step. The historian observed quietly, his hands folded, eyes scanning the inscriptions and marks. The crown is more than a symbol. he said. "It tests those who serve it. Every misalignment, every anomaly, every choice made in its presence is a reflection of intent. And now, the true measure of loyalty is upon us." Hart considered this carefully. The palace, its corridors and its relics were not passive witnesses. They were active participants in the unfolding moral trial. Each artifact, each protocol, each ceremonial gesture carried the weight of centuries. The insider had manipulated this system, exploiting both tradition and the trust inherent in the royal guard. The breach was not simply a violation. It was a challenge, a gauntlet, and a declaration of calculated ambition. They moved toward the inner corridors, where the Queen's advisors and guards maintained their stations. Hart observed each step, each gesture, each glance. Loyalty was now a landscape of micro-actions, small but telling, a hesitation, a glance, a sigh, a misaligned gesture. The palace itself seemed to respond, shadows lengthening, echoes softening, as though testing those who moved within its halls. Hart paused before a sealed door, one rarely accessed except during ceremonial events. He traced the carved details, noting minute scratches along the edges, subtle signs of tampering. "The breach is deeper than we anticipated," he said quietly. "This is not merely a test of vigilance. It is a test of judgment, conscience, and moral resolve." A sudden whisper broke the silence. One of the junior guards, anxious yet disciplined, spoke. "Captain, the diary. It mentions someone close to the Queen, someone with influence." Hart's eyes narrowed. "Yes," he replied, voice measured. "And that makes the challenge even more delicate. Confrontation must be precise, evidence absolute. A mistake could destabilize not only the guard, but the palace itself." They continued through hidden corridors, rooms long forgotten, passages sealed for decades. Dust settled in stillness, but each footprint, each displaced object, each subtle mark became evidence of intent. Hart catalogued everything carefully, understanding that betrayal in such a sacred space was not only an act of ambition. It was a moral violation, a fracture in the continuity of trust that defined the royal guard. The palace seemed to pulse around them, silent yet alive. In the distance, the faint memory of the crown's glow reminded Hart of what was at stake. It was a symbol of legacy, of duty, and of the moral weight carried by those sworn to protect it. The breach, the diary, the cryptic notes, they were all part of a test, a crucible designed to separate fidelity from ambition, loyalty from deceit. Hours passed in methodical observation. Every shadowed alcove, every overlooked ledger, every piece of ceremonial regalia was examined with painstaking care. The evidence accumulated like a growing storm, a moral and procedural tempest demanding resolution. Hart understood the inevitability. The confrontation with the traitor would come, and when it did, every choice, every hesitation, every moral decision would be measured by history and by the crown itself. Finally, they reached a chamber long sealed, its door adorned with ceremonial locks and intricate engravings. Hart traced the carvings with his fingers, noting subtle signs of disturbance. This room, he realized, might hold the next piece of the puzzle, a clue, a confession, or a revelation that would clarify the identity of the traitor. The palace's silence seemed to hold its breath, aware that the weight of betrayal was about to be illuminated. Hart's hand rested on the door, feeling the cold stone beneath his gloves. Beyond it lay evidence of ambition, manipulation, and moral compromise. Secrets that would fracture trust and force every guard to confront the depth of their loyalty. The moment of revelation was near. Somewhere within the palace, the traitor awaited, and the consequences of exposure would ripple through history, loyalty, and conscience alike. The door creaked as Captain Hart eased it open, the sound swallowed by the heavy stone walls surrounding the chamber. Inside, the air was dense with the weight of time-ancient dust, mingled with the faint metallic tang of long, forgotten ink, and the faint echo of past footsteps seemed to linger like whispers caught in the marble. Shadows danced across ceremonial relics, their forms distorted by the flickering candlelight, turning symbols of loyalty into ominous omens. Hart stepped forward, gloved hands steady, mind meticulously cataloguing every detail. The insider, the traitor whose manipulations had tested every measure of fidelity, had left subtle markers, a ledger slightly out of place, a ceremonial seal misaligned, a faint imprint of gloves on a desk where none should have been. Every trace was deliberate, designed to communicate, mislead, and manipulate, revealing both cunning and audacity. From the far corner a figure emerged. The Queen's senior advisor, long trusted and respected, stood motionless, expression composed yet taut with restrained tension. Hart's eyes met theirs, unflinching. Silence hung between them, thick as the stone walls, each heartbeat resonating with the moral gravity of what was about to unfold. "You know why you are here," Hart said quietly, voice carrying authority tempered with moral weight. The advisor's eyes flickered, the briefest sign of recognition betraying the carefully maintained composure. "Yes," they replied, voice steady, measured. "I suppose the crown has chosen to test not only those who guard it, but those who guide it." Hart's mind catalogued the subtle deflection in the words, the careful framing of truth as a philosophical rationale, but the evidence, the diary, the coded notes, the ledger discrepancies, spoke otherwise. This was deliberate manipulation, a breach not only of protocol, but of trust, ethics, and duty. Every step had been calculated to exploit loyalty, to erode certainty, and to assert control over perception itself. "You have orchestrated the breach," Hart stated, measured yet undeniable. "Every ledger anomaly, every subtle alteration, every cryptic note, it leads back to you. The Crown's trust has been tested, and so has mine. Your ambition has cast a shadow across the palace, and now it must be weighed against history, protocol, and moral duty." The advisor's gaze faltered for the briefest moment, revealing the human vulnerability beneath the veneer of authority. "Do you believe I sought to harm the crown?" they asked softly, almost pleading. "I sought only to uncover truths that were hidden, to illuminate weaknesses that could endanger the palace in ways even your vigilance could not foresee." Hart's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, its weight grounding him in the immediacy of duty. "Your ambition masqueraded as foresight. The crown is not an instrument to test others. It is a responsibility to safeguard, manipulating the hierarchy, undermining trust, exploiting loyalty. These are betrayals, not guidance. The consequences of your actions cannot be ignored." The chamber seemed to close in around them. The faint glow from a distant window illuminated ceremonial swords, gilded scrolls, and the worn tapestry of a coronation long past. Symbols of fidelity and legacy now bore the weight of transgression, every artifact a reminder that betrayal was not abstract. It was tangible, observed, and morally consequential. The advisor lowered their eyes, a subtle admission, a recognition of failure and consequence. "Then judge me as you must," they said quietly. "I accept the weight of my choices." Hart considered the words, noting the sincerity beneath the careful defenses. The palace demanded justice, but it also demanded measured discipline, ceremonial precision, and moral clarity. Punishment was not merely an act, it was a restoration of order, a reaffirmation of duty. Hart signaled to his patrol to secure the chamber, ensuring that all evidence, the diary, ledgers, coded notes, was preserved, catalogued, and recorded. Each detail mattered, each trace of intent documented. Betrayal was not a moment to be hidden or ignored. It was a moral and historical truth, requiring recognition, consequence, and careful judgment. The advisor took a step forward, hands raised slightly in deference. "I will abide by whatever decision you deem necessary," they said. "The crown, the palace, and the lineage of trust are more important than my ambition, my reputation, or my comfort. Let the truth guide your hand." Hart paused, the weight of responsibility pressing against him like the stone ceiling above. Every choice, every decision, every subtle gesture of authority was now amplified by centuries of expectation, ritual, and moral precedent. The palace, in its silence, seemed to acknowledge the gravity of the moment, as though history itself leaned in to observe, to judge, and to record. Hours passed in deliberate reflection. Hart consulted the diary, the ledgers, and his own meticulous notes. Each inconsistency, each subtle manipulation, and each coded entry confirmed the same conclusion. The breach had been orchestrated to test, manipulate, and exploit loyalty. Yet the human element, recognition of error, submission to consequence, acknowledgement of responsibility, provided a measure of moral resolution. Finally, Hart addressed the advisor directly, ceremonial authority tempered with moral clarity. "You will face the consequences of your actions, as dictated by protocol and tradition," he said. "Your manipulation has fractured trust, challenged duty, and endangered the sanctity of the crown. The path to restoration begins with accountability, discipline, and acknowledgement of every misstep." The advisor nodded, accepting the pronouncement. The moral weight of betrayal had been fully recognized, measured, and addressed within the framework of centuries-old protocol. Every step of the process had been deliberate, ceremonial, and reflective, ensuring that the consequences were not merely punitive but restorative, reaffirming both the authority of the crown and the integrity of the royal guard. The chamber seemed to exhale, the tension dissolving slowly into silence. Shadows retreated, leaving only the soft glow of candlelight reflecting against stone and gilded artifacts. Hart felt the weight of centuries pressing lightly on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the continuity of duty, fidelity, and moral clarity. As the first light of dawn filtered through high windows, illuminating the chamber with pale gold, Hart allowed himself a moment of reflection. The traitor had been confronted, discipline ensured, and trust restored. But the palace, the crown, and the centuries of vigilance demanded ongoing watchfulness. The decisions made in shadowed halls had irreversible consequences, and every guardian of the crown now bore the quiet, enduring weight of loyalty tested, trust shattered, and order restored. The palace was quiet, but not silent. The echoes of the night's revelations still lingered in the halls, a subdued reminder of the betrayal that had fractured trust and tested the very fabric of loyalty. Captain Elias Hart walked steadily through corridors now filled with the soft, deliberate rhythm of restored routine. Guards moved with renewed discipline, every step and gesture measured, reflecting the weight of both responsibility and moral clarity. The coronation crown glimmered faintly in its display, untouched sacred, a symbol of continuity. Hart's eyes lingered on it, tracing the familiar curves and facets. Its glow, once a marker of tension and intrigue, now carried a sense of reassurance. The crown was not merely an object of gold and jewels. It was a touchstone of order, a silent arbiter that had tested, observed, and guided the actions of those sworn to protect it. In the council chamber, the aftermath of the previous night's confrontation was evident. Ledgers and diaries had been meticulously catalogued, every note cross-referenced, every anomaly recorded. The advisor who had orchestrated the breach was present, their demeanor subdued but accepting, following ceremonial procedures dictated by protocol. The moral weight of their actions had been acknowledged, and the process of restoration had begun. Hart addressed the assembled guards and advisors, his voice calm yet authoritative. "Trust is not destroyed by a single act, nor is it restored in haste. It is cultivated through diligence, observation, and the disciplined adherence to duty. The palace, the crown, and our sacred traditions demand that we reaffirm our commitment to these principles." Each word carried weight, resonating with the collective consciousness of those present. The younger guards, previously tense and uncertain, now moved with quiet confidence, reassured by Hart's measured presence. Each step, each gesture, each interaction reinforced the renewed order. Discipline, once tested and fractured, was gradually realigned with the moral and procedural standards that had defined the royal guard for centuries. The historian observed silently, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the alignment of ceremonial objects, and the careful placement of ledgers and documents. "The crown observes not only our actions but our intentions," he murmured to Hart. "Restoration is more than procedural. It is ethical, spiritual, and symbolic. The past, present, and future converge in the careful re-establishment of trust." Hart nodded, understanding that the historian's words were as much a reflection on duty as on ceremony. They moved to the archive chamber, where the breach had been meticulously documented. Every ledger, note, and diary entry had been cross-referenced, each anomaly reconciled with corroborating evidence. The process was deliberate, methodical, and ceremonial, ensuring that every trace of deception was accounted for, every moral breach recognized, and every step toward restoration measured with precision. A subtle tension still lingered among some of the younger guards. Hart addressed it directly, emphasizing the continuity of duty over personal sentiment. "The breach tested us, yes, but our response defines us more than the actions of one individual. Loyalty, discipline, and vigilance are not abstract ideals. They are lived, practiced, and reinforced every day in our choices and actions." His words, delivered with calm authority, carried the weight of centuries of tradition, emphasizing both the gravity and the dignity of the moment. The palace itself seemed to respond. Shadows receded, sunlight filtered through high windows, and the cool stone walls radiated a sense of stability. The coronation crown, secure atop its pedestal, reflected the light with a quiet brilliance. Its glow now symbolized not merely vigilance, but the restoration of moral and ceremonial equilibrium, a tangible reminder that order had been reasserted without compromise. Hart moved among the patrol, observing gestures of reconciliation and professional conduct. Advisors previously divided by suspicion now worked in quiet synchrony, guided by the authority of ritual, the clarity of evidence, and the acknowledgement of consequences. The weight of betrayal had been addressed, and the structures of trust were being restored deliberately, ceremoniously, and morally. A ceremonial ledger was presented to Hart, recording the resolution of the breach, the acknowledgement of betrayal, and the steps toward restoration. Each entry was precise, symbolic, and reflective of the ethical framework of the Royal Guard. Hart traced the ink with his gloved hand, noting the subtle elegance of each signature, each mark, each indication of accountability. The palace's history was being reaffirmed, every choice documented for posterity, every act of discipline codified within centuries of tradition. The advisor who had orchestrated the breach stepped forward, participating fully in the ceremonial act of acknowledgement and discipline. Their posture was straight, hands folded respectfully, eyes lowered in deference. Hart observed, noting both the human acceptance of consequence and the symbolic restoration of order. This was more than procedural. It was a moral and ethical realignment, a return to fidelity, duty, and trust. As midday approached, the palace continued to hum with quiet activity. Guards performed their routines with renewed precision, ceremonial objects were returned to exact alignment, and corridors once shadowed by doubt now reflected the deliberate rhythms of restored order. Hart walked among them, observing, guiding, and reinforcing the moral and procedural frameworks that defined their service. The historian approached him quietly. The crown has been tested, and the palace has endured. Yet vigilance remains essential. Restoration is not a single act. It is a continuous practice. Every choice from this day forward will either affirm or erode the trust that has been painstakingly re-established. Hart nodded, understanding the layers of moral responsibility embedded in the statement. Trust was not a static achievement. It was a living, ongoing commitment. In the central hall, Hart paused, allowing himself a moment to reflect on the events that had unfolded. The betrayal had been confronted, order restored, and the moral framework reinforced. Yet the palace, the crown, and the centuries of vigilance demanded ongoing attention. The glowing artifact atop its pedestal was both a reminder and a guide, marking the intersection of history, loyalty, and moral clarity. Hart's eyes lingered on the coronation crown, its glow now quiet, dignified, and resolute. Justice had been served, loyalty reaffirmed, and the palace returned to ceremonial equilibrium. Yet even in the calm of restored order, a subtle awareness remained. History continued, vigilance persisted, and every guardian of the crown would bear the responsibility of maintaining both tradition and moral clarity. The next steps were quiet, deliberate, and eternal. Morning light poured into the palace, soft and golden, painting the marble floors with streaks of warmth. The echoes of the previous night's betrayal had faded, replaced by the deliberate cadence of order. Guards moved with synchronized precision, ceremonial weapons gleaming, footsteps measured and purposeful. Every gesture, every glance, every alignment of ceremonial objects reaffirmed the palace's return to harmony. Captain Elias Hart walked through the central hall, observing silently. The coronation crown remained untouched atop its pedestal, its glow steady, now more a symbol of resilience than a warning. The atmosphere had shifted. Tension gave way to solemn dignity, suspicion replaced by disciplined vigilance, and the palace itself seemed to breathe again in quiet equilibrium. The senior advisor, who had orchestrated the breach, now participated fully in the ceremonial routines of restitution. Their posture was upright, hands folded in respect, eyes lowered in acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Each step they took was a deliberate demonstration of accountability, a moral act within the procedural and ceremonial frameworks that had governed the palace for centuries. Hart noted the subtle gestures of contrition, the careful alignment of ledgers, the precise placement of ceremonial tools, the respectful observation of protocols previously violated. These were small acts, yet each carried immense symbolic weight. In the council chamber, Hart oversaw the formal documentation of the breach and its resolution. Ledgers, diaries, and notes were compiled meticulously, every entry cross-referenced, every anomaly reconciled. The historian observed quietly, offering measured guidance when necessary. The palace endures because it records, observes, and learns. He said softly, "Restoration is not simply correction. It is the conscious affirmation of loyalty, fidelity, and moral clarity." Hart nodded, understanding the depth of the statement. The breach had tested not only procedure, but the moral fabric of those sworn to protect the crown. Restoration was as much about ethical reaffirmation as it was about physical security. Every guardian's actions now carried the weight of precedent. Every choice was a continuation of centuries of trust, and every ceremonial gesture reflected the palace's enduring principles. The younger guards moved with renewed confidence, their steps reflecting the re-establishment of structure and trust. Conversations were careful, deliberate, yet infused with a quiet sense of reassurance. Where once hesitation and doubt had shadowed their faces, there was now a calm attentiveness, an understanding that their actions directly contributed to both the preservation of order and the moral authority of the royal guard. Hart returned to the crown's pedestal, observing the subtle gleam that caught the morning light. Its brilliance was no longer an enigmatic challenge, but a symbol of continuity. The events of the past days had revealed human weakness, tested vigilance, and demanded moral clarity. Now, the crown stood as a testament to the palace's resilience, to the enduring responsibility of those sworn to protect it, and to the delicate balance between duty and conscience. A ceremonial bell tolled softly from the central tower, signaling the beginning of formal proceedings to solidify the restored order. Advisors, guards, and palace officials gathered in precise formation, each aware of their position and responsibility. Hart observed, ensuring that every gesture, every step, every alignment adhered to centuries of tradition. The act of restoration was not spontaneous. It was deliberate, ceremonial, and morally grounded. The senior advisor, having acknowledged wrongdoing, now presented a formal declaration of contrition. "I submit myself to the judgment and guidance of the royal guard and the crown," they intoned. Their voice carried both humility and dignity, a reflection of understanding the moral gravity of their actions. Hart's eyes met theirs, acknowledging the sincerity. This act was not only procedural, it was a moral realignment, a public affirmation of fidelity to duty and respect for the institution. The historian stepped forward, voice resonant yet measured. "Let the records reflect that the crown was challenged, the guardians tested, and the breach resolved through discipline, vigilance, and moral integrity. May these events serve as a lesson to all who serve and observe that loyalty must be cultivated, trust maintained, and duty honored." His words echoed through the hall, the weight of centuries in each syllable. Hart oversaw the ceremonial resecuring of the coronation crown. Each step of the process was deliberate. Gloves donned, pedestal inspected, protective barriers aligned, and sacred protocols observed. The act was both literal and symbolic. The crown's safety represented not only physical protection, but also the preservation of moral and institutional integrity. Every motion, every gesture, every careful placement underscored the palace's enduring principles. As the ceremony concluded, Hart allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The palace, once fractured by betrayal and uncertainty, now resonated with quiet order. Loyalty had been tested, deception confronted, and moral clarity restored. Yet he knew that vigilance was perpetual. The palace's stability depended not only on the resolution of a single betrayal, but on the ongoing dedication of each guardian to uphold duty, ethics, and the sacred trust of the crown. The younger guards filed past the crown, each pausing in silent acknowledgement of their renewed responsibility. The senior advisor observed from a respectful distance, having completed their act of restitution. Hart's gaze lingered on both the crown and the assembled guardians. The palace had endured, its order restored not through mere authority, but through moral reckoning, ceremonial discipline, and the conscious affirmation of loyalty. Finally, Hart walked through the halls alone, the sunlight now filling spaces that had been shadowed by suspicion and uncertainty. The weight of betrayal had been addressed, yet the lessons remained. Trust once fractured required cultivation. Loyalty once tested demanded vigilance, and duty once challenged necessitated deliberate, morally guided action. The palace was restored, but the responsibility of guardianship endured, quietly and perpetually, in every step, gesture, and decision. As Hart's footsteps echoed through the restored halls, the coronation crown gleamed softly, a symbol of resilience, continuity, and sacred duty. The palace had returned to order, yet the memory of betrayal lingered as a reminder that vigilance, discipline, and moral clarity were eternal responsibilities. The next chapter of the palace's history would unfold quietly, deliberately, under the watchful glow of the crown and the unwavering gaze of those sworn to protect it. The palace lay quiet at dawn. Light spilled softly through towering windows, tracing intricate patterns on the marble floors and gilded archways. Every corridor, every hall, every chamber held echoes of the night's trials, yet the atmosphere was no longer tense. It was contemplative. Captain Elias Hart moved slowly, deliberately, his steps measured to match the rhythm of the palace waking in silence. The coronation crown, secure atop its pedestal, caught the first rays of sunlight. Its glow, once a marker of tension and moral challenge, now seemed imbued with a calm permanence. Hart studied it closely, noticing how the facets reflected light differently depending on angle, as if subtly shifting to mirror the mind of the observer. The crown was more than a relic. It was a witness, a teacher, and a keeper of the palace's enduring principles. Hart walked along the central hall, allowing the silence to settle around him. The events of the past days, the breach, the betrayal, the confrontation, and the restoration, played in his mind like a slow-moving tapestry. He considered the fragility of trust and the weight of vigilance. Each guardian of the crown carried the responsibility not only to protect its physical form, but to uphold the moral and historical continuity it represented. He paused at a window overlooking the palace gardens. Mist hovered above manicured hedges, and the first birds of morning stirred softly among the trees. The serene imagery contrasted sharply with the intensity of recent events. Hart reflected on the paradox of guardianship. Moments of crisis were inevitable, yet the ongoing maintenance of order, morality, and loyalty demanded quiet, persistent attention, far from the dramatic confrontation of shadows and intrigue. The historian approached, walking softly on the polished floors. "The crown is more than vigilance or discipline," he murmured. "It is memory, legacy, and moral gravity. Its glow is a reminder that each action, each choice, each gesture in its presence is observed, not by eyes alone, but by centuries of consequence." Hart nodded, understanding that the lesson extended beyond the palace, beyond protocol, beyond duty. It was eternal. They walked together through the restored corridors, noting how every detail had been realigned. Ceremonial objects returned to precise positions, ledgers ordered meticulously, and guards performing their duties with a serene attentiveness. The palace itself seemed alive, not through whispers of conspiracy or tension, but through the quiet hum of enduring order, maintained by human vigilance and moral fidelity. Hart reflected on the individuals involved in the recent events. The advisor who had breached trust had submitted fully to consequence and discipline, their actions now incorporated into the formal records and moral teachings of the palace. The younger guards had observed, learned, and internalized the lessons of vigilance, integrity, and procedural fidelity. Every participant had become part of the palace's living history, a reminder that the crown's glow was not simply an ornament, but a moral arbiter. They reached a small chamber rarely visited by anyone outside the senior council. Sunlight slanted through high windows, illuminating dust motes in the air like suspended fragments of memory. Hart traced his fingers along carved archways, considering the weight of centuries resting upon these walls. Every choice made within them, every act of duty, betrayal, and restoration, was preserved in stone, wood, and record. The palace was more than architecture. It was an enduring testament to the consequences of human action and the importance of moral clarity. The historian gestured toward a tapestry depicting a past coronation. "Notice the details," he said quietly. The positioning of hands, the gestures of guards, the subtle orientation of ceremonial objects. Every element carries meaning, a moral codex silently observed through generations. The crown does not judge through force alone. It teaches through consequence, reflection, and witness. Hart lingered, contemplating the lesson. The crown's recent test had been severe, exposing ambition, betrayal, and ethical complexity. Yet the resolution, the careful restoration of order, the acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and the reaffirmation of loyalty, had demonstrated the enduring power of moral and procedural continuity. Vigilance, he realized, was not the absence of human failure, but the presence of disciplined observation, ethical guidance, and deliberate action. As they continued through the halls, Hart noticed small signs of life returning to the palace. Guards shared quiet nods of recognition, advisors engaged in measured consultation, and ceremonial objects were inspected with meticulous care. The palace's rhythm, once disrupted, was now restored, not through urgency or confrontation, but through patience, reflection, and moral attention. The crown's glow acted as both a guide and a mirror, reflecting the intentions, actions, and conscience of those who served it. Hart paused near the grand staircase, looking down at the courtyard below. Morning dew glimmered on the stone, and fountains reflected the pale light in gentle ripples. The tranquility was a stark contrast to the shadows of the previous nights, yet it was fragile. The lessons learned, the vulnerabilities exposed, the betrayals confronted, the moral clarity restored, were not permanent unless continuously observed, honored, and enacted by those entrusted with the palace's legacy. The historian spoke again, voice low, contemplative. The crown's light is eternal in purpose, but finite in witness. It illuminates only what is present, known, and observed. Beyond its glow, there are always unseen corridors, unrecorded choices, and hidden intentions. The guardian's responsibility is perpetual, their vigilance never complete, yet always necessary. Hart absorbed the words, understanding that the calm of morning was temporary and precious, yet only a momentary pause in the ongoing responsibility of duty. They moved through the private chambers of the royal guard, noting the subtle realignment of personal discipline and ceremonial preparedness. Hart understood that restoration was more than procedural. It was ethical, emotional, and symbolic. The palace's continuity depended on this blend of vigilance, morality, and reflection, ensuring that each guardian's actions were guided not only by protocol, but by conscience. Finally, Hart returned to the central hall, pausing before the coronation crown. Its face, it caught the sunlight, scattering delicate patterns across the polished floors. He considered the crown not merely as an artifact, but as a teacher, a witness, and a moral compass. Every glint, every reflection, every facet served as a reminder that vigilance, loyalty, and moral clarity were eternal responsibilities, lessons that transcended any single breach or moment of betrayal. Hart's eyes lingered on the crown, the palace bathed in serene morning light. The past had been confronted, trust restored, and order reaffirmed, but the glow of the crown remained a quiet, eternal reminder. Vigilance must continue, moral clarity must endure, and history, like the palace itself, is always observed by those who serve faithfully. Yet somewhere in the shadowed corridors, mysteries remain. Secrets the crown cannot illuminate, waiting for the next careful observer to uncover them. The palace at mid-morning was bathed in a gentle, almost sacred light. Sunbeams filtered through towering windows, scattering across marble floors, gilded archways, and polished stone walls. The corridors, once echoing with tension, now carried only the soft rhythm of daily duty, the quiet footfalls of guards, the rustle of robes, the muted clink of ceremonial armor. Yet beneath this serenity, the weight of the past days lingered, subtle but pervasive, like a memory embedded in the stones themselves. Captain Elias Hart walked slowly through the grand hall, pausing often to observe the interplay of light and shadow. The coronation crown glimmered atop its pedestal, no longer a source of urgent tension, but a calm emblem of continuity and vigilance. Its face, its scattered sunlight in fleeting, delicate patterns across the floors, a visual echo of the moral lessons it bore witness to. The crown, Hart realized, had always been more than a relic. It was a teacher, a mirror, a silent custodian of the palace's history and values. Hart's steps took him to the edge of the private gardens. Morning mist hovered above manicured hedges, dew sparkled on the leaves, and birds chirped softly, undisturbed by human passage. He lingered here, letting the calm of the natural world penetrate the residue of anxiety left by recent events. The palace, in its enduring structure and deliberate order, had survived betrayal, deception, and ambition, but the responsibility to maintain its moral and ceremonial integrity was perpetual. Vigilance was not merely a reaction to crisis, it was a continuous, deliberate practice. He thought of the advisors, the young guards, and the historian. All of them had witnessed the crown's test in their own ways. Some had faltered, some had been tempted, some had been tested by circumstance beyond their control. Yet all had learned, in ways both explicit and subtle, that the crown's presence was both observation and guidance. Every act, whether of obedience, reflection, or hesitation, contributed to the ongoing moral narrative of the palace. The historian appeared quietly at Hart's side, his gaze following the play of light across the floors. The crown illuminates, he said softly, but it cannot dictate action. It observes, it reflects, it teaches, but the responsibility lies with those who serve. Integrity, vigilance, and conscience are not conferred by gold or jewel. They are exercised, nurtured, and upheld. Hart nodded, letting the words sink in. The crown's glow had been both a test and a witness. It had revealed human ambition, exposed vulnerabilities, and demanded reflection. But it had also guided the palace toward restoration, moral clarity, and ceremonial fidelity. Its presence reminded Hart that every decision, every action, every silent choice carried weight beyond the immediate, echoing through time, through tradition, and through the lives of those sworn to its protection. He moved through the restored corridors, observing the subtle rhythms of life returning to the palace. Guards exchanged quiet, respectful gestures. Ceremonial objects had been returned to their precise positions. Ledgers were meticulously catalogued. Advisors consulted with measured deliberation. The palace itself seemed to breathe again, not with relief or triumph, but with the steady pulse of enduring order, maintained by those committed to the ongoing practice of loyalty and conscience. Hart paused before a tall portrait depicting a past coronation. The monarch's painted gaze seemed to follow him, eyes steady and assessing, as though recording his presence in the continuum of history. He considered the lessons of the past nights. Ambition could fracture trust, betrayal could test the foundations of duty, and vigilance required constant, conscious exercise. But equally, he saw that the palace was resilient, capable of moral and procedural restoration through deliberate, disciplined action. The crown's light and the palace's architecture carried these lessons silently, eternally, to those willing to observe and act. He traced his hand along the railing of the grand staircase, feeling the smooth carved wood beneath his gloves. Each groove, each line, each subtle imperfection was a record of centuries of human care, attention, and presence. The palace itself was a repository of history and morality. Every surface a witness, every corridor a guide. To serve it was to participate in a continuum of fidelity, vigilance, and ethical action. Hart allowed himself a moment to reflect on the delicate balance of history and human action. The breach, the betrayal, and the restoration had not been merely events. They had been tests, lessons, and reminders of the Crown's moral gravity. Trust was fragile, yet repairable. Vigilance was eternal, yet invisible in its quiet practice. Loyalty was both a conscious choice and a sacred duty. He continued to the outer galleries, where sunlight fell across tapestries and artifacts in muted brilliance. The visual beauty of the palace, combined with the weight of its lessons, created a space both meditative and instructive. Hart understood that the Crown's role was not punitive, nor was the palace itself a mere setting. It was a living repository of human consequence, ethical reflection, and historical continuity. Every guardian's presence, every deliberate act, reinforced the palace's enduring moral and ceremonial order. The historian paused beside Hart, gesturing toward a small, unassuming door at the far end of the gallery. "There are always corners unseen, corridors unlit," he said softly. "The Crown cannot illuminate all, the palace cannot observe every intention, but those who serve faithfully, who act with conscience and integrity, ensure that even the unseen is guided by the lessons of history, the weight of morality, and the vigilance of tradition." Hart lingered there for a moment, imagining the hidden corridors, the shadows beyond the light, and the quiet mysteries that remained. The Crown's glow was finite, but human vigilance could extend its influence, safeguarding not only the artifact itself, but the principles it embodied. He realized that duty was both immediate and eternal, requiring conscious reflection and deliberate practice. As the morning advanced, Hart walked slowly back to the central hall. The palace, once tested by ambition and shadow, now resonated with quiet dignity, ceremonial order, and moral clarity. Every gesture, every alignment, every footstep reflected centuries of continuity and the conscious application of vigilance and conscience. The Crown remained, glowing softly, a silent witness and guide. Hart's gaze lingered on the coronation crown as sunlight filled the palace, scattering delicate patterns across marble floors. History had been confronted, trust restored, and order reaffirmed. Yet beyond the crown's illumination, mysteries remained, hidden corners, unspoken truths, and lessons yet to be learned. The palace endured, vigilant and eternal, and those who served it bore the quiet responsibility of upholding both history and conscience, ever ready for the next shadow that might stir.